Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 59 of Fracking Nightmare. Now, a slight change in the format tonight. It's going to be a two-part show. In the first part, which will be about 15-20 minutes or so, we're going to have a catch-up on events that have occurred during the week, and a lot has been going on. Then we'll take a very short break, and then after that, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Ian Fairlie, who is a specialist on radioactivity in the environment. And he has some pretty serious concerns about what is unfolding or potentially unfolding in the UK regarding unconventional gas and the radioactive waste that will inevitably result if this insidious industry actually gets a foothold in the UK. But let's take a look at what's been occurring in the past week. You'll remember that last week I advised that I had sent a Freedom of Information request to Lancashire County Council to request the information as to what this lady was doing, having almost open access to Stuart Perigo, the council planning officer, throughout the hearings over Quadrilla's planning applications for Oscar and Preston New Road a couple of weeks ago. We have asked who she was working for, whether she was working for Quadrilla or for Lancashire County Council, and if not, who was she working for? Now, what was her brief? And in the remote possibility that it's a case of mistaken identity, then of course we will submit a further request to ask who this person was, because we have spoken to a couple of councillors and they seem to have no idea. So this Freedom of Information request is ongoing. I have had a routine response from Lancashire County Council saying that they've received the request and they will get the reply to me by the due date, which is the 31st of July. So another 3 weeks yet. Now, during the week, a number of things have been unfolding. Not least, I got a message through, I think it was on Wednesday afternoon of last week, that this gentleman, David Lenigas, Dodgy David Lenigas, as I have labelled him, following his attempts to ramp up the UKOG, UK Oil and Gas penny stocks, which he actually did quite successfully back in April following the release of the New Tech report, stating that there was more hydrocarbons under the Weald in the south of England than under the entire North Sea. Well, on episode 50, I actually called him out on that just a few days after he announced that revelation, and said that the report was a complete crock. Well, it transpires that David Lenigas has actually stood down from his role of chairman of UKOG. And here it is in The Guardian, UK Oil and Gas chairman who wanted to drill under Gatwick. The Gatwick gusher has stepped down. David Lenigas, the flamboyant executive who made ambitious claims that there were up to 100 billion barrels of oil under the ground close to Gatwick Airport in southern England, has abruptly stepped down from his position as executive chairman of UK Oil and Gas Investments. No reason was given other than a formal announcement from the small independent oil explorer saying Lenigas would focus on other business interests. Well, in the Times, it actually made a slightly different observation. David Lenigas leaves the gushing to someone else. Says the outspoken entrepreneur behind the so-called Gatwick gusher oil discovery has stood down from the down from the company leading the exploration drilling in an attempt to improve the company's credibility. Now, that's a rather telling statement, isn't it? So, in other words, David Lenigas's association with UK Oil and Gas was impacting upon the credibility of the company. Now, suffice to say that I have never had any direct contact with David Lenigas. I make my observations and comments as objectively as possible from afar. But I was actually copied in on this tweet that David Lenigas sent out that evening, where he wrote, Just for 100% complete clarification, it was 100% my choice to retire from UKOG. I planned this for a while, found a great man in Steve. Well, I was a bit surprised to sort of receive that, but me thinks that David Lenigas did protest death too much. So my response was simply, I guess you didn't step down voluntarily then. Well, that was actually responded with a rather aggressive tweet, which David Lenigas has now decided to remove. But I followed that with a simple observation. I said, thank you very much for the confirmation that the anti-fracking community is having impact. So it was the anti-fracking community that drew attention to the potentially fraudulent nature of these two reports, certainly based on some outright conjecture. The Schlumberger report, I am still stunned at the Schlumberger report, taking a number that had already been admitted was plucked out of thin air and multiplying it by 70%. But of course, they did write in their report that nobody other than employees of UKOG should take it seriously, which was perhaps a bit of a giveaway there. Well, the UKOG stock price hasn't really recovered. It's just under 2 pence, still, significantly above the halfpenny that it was wallowing at prior to the announcement that there was 100 billion barrels under the Weald. But nonetheless, obviously, a number of mug punters who still think that they're better off hanging in there. So the anti-fracking community certainly has the chief executives of these companies in its sights. And if we look at these individuals here, we have Andrew Austin of iGas, who really probably left of his own volition, but certainly didn't help his case by some fairly dodgy share trading last year. And we have Lord John Brown, formerly chairman of Quadrilla and also on the board of Riverstone Holdings, one of Quadrilla's financial backers. But Lord John Brown has now stood down from Quadrilla and has also stood down from the board of Riverstone Holdings. Then we have David Lenigas. Of course, David Lenigas has now stood down from UKOG. So could we have that picture back on the screen a second? So there we go. There's these guys have all gone. Who does that leave? Well, Francis Egan. He's still Chief Executive Officer of Quadrilla. Although I've got to say, Francis, you're certainly aging rapidly. And I'm sure that events of the past few weeks and Friday's announcement, which I'll come to in a second, will have you aging even quicker. And then we have John Dewar of Third Energy. Third Energy owned, of course, by, or 97% owned by Barclays Bank. And as we discussed last week, Third Energy are looking to frack a deep well known as KM8, Kirby Misperton 8, which sits just outside the village of Kirby Misperton, about 100, well, exactly 1 kilometre, in fact, from the entrance to Flamingo Land, North Yorkshire's largest revenue-generating tourist attraction. So we also made reference last week in the programme with our interview with Sue Goff, who is a resident from the adjacent village to Kirby Misperton. And she was telling us that Third Energy had requested to defer their application to drill and frack at Kirby Misperton. And that deferment was based on a letter that they had received from North Yorkshire County Council. Now, Third Energy were being somewhat less than transparent in divulging the content of that letter, claiming that it was simply an administrative issue, that they'd spelt one of the roads wrong and got a location slightly incorrect. Well, a Freedom of Information request submitted by the Frack Free Rydale Group actually revealed the full extent of this letter, and you can read this letter on the Frack Free Rydale website. That's www.frackfreerydale.org. And here's just a summary of some of the more blatant omissions that North Yorkshire Council have pointed out to Third Energy. Apparently in their application, They had the wrong minerals development checklist. They had no flood risk assessment, which is a statutory obligation. The site plan was not clearly defined on one of the plans submitted. The site plan did not follow the County Council's list of validation requirements, particularly in relation to defining public rights of way, and is based upon an out-of-date Ordnance Survey map, which excluded the caravan and camping site, which is actually less than 400 metres from the well site. A utilities assessment had not been provided, and plans and drawings are inconsistent and require the reader to undertake a significant exercise in cross-correlation to understand them. And of course, this is from a company that claims to be, ultra professional, that we can trust them, that they've got all their ducks in the proverbial row. Well, I wouldn't trust them any further than I could throw them over my proverbial shoulder. Well, Sue Goff last week was expressing her anger and disgust at the article which had appeared in the Times the previous weekend, which effectively sought to completely ignore all input from the residents. Well, that was rectified this week, although I think it was the Independent rather than Times. There was a headline, Fracking, Pennines residents mobilised to stop company drilling up to 950 wells in Thirsk and Moreton. Well, sadly, it looks as though the headline writer probably rarely gets out of London or north of Watford Gap, because North Yorkshire is really not quite in the Pennines, but nonetheless, it's the right side of the country. But the article itself was absolutely spot on, and it did make reference to the concerns that the community have over Third Energy's plans. Well, the Yorkshire Post actually held a poll this past weekend, and the poll was run through Saturday and Sunday, and then the results were published in today's Yorkshire Post. And there you have it. Do you support fracking in Yorkshire? Yes, 14%, no, 86%. So, obviously, John Dewar of Third Energy has responded, and this is literally from 4 o'clock this afternoon, where he insists that Third Energy insists that the Rydale fracking application has not collapsed. Apparently some were alleging that. And here was a comment that he wrote regarding the article in the Yorkshire Post. It says, regarding Third Energy's application for permission to hydraulically fracture our existing well at Kirby Misperton gives a misleading impression, some of which is due to excitable headline writing, some due to the weaknesses of the Freedom of Information Act procedures. Now, that's an interesting observation, some due to the weaknesses of the Freedom of Information Act. In other words, John Dewar would much preferred for the letter from North Yorkshire Council never to have found its way into the public domain. Well, John, Frack Free Rydale and a number of other emerging groups in the area have their sights on Third Energy. And, suffice to say that Quadrilla did not find it, they had an easy ride in Lancashire, and you're about to find out that you're up against an even tougher opposition in Yorkshire, because they have learned from their colleagues in Lancashire. And they have things in their armoury that you haven't even begun to consider yet. So I'm looking forward to the next meeting in Helmsley on July 23rd. That'll be the first brush where Third Energy go back to North York Moors Planning Committee to try and get permission to drill their re-injection well on Eberston Moor. So a lot more coming from our colleagues in North Yorkshire. Meanwhile, if things weren't bad enough for Quadrilla with events in Lancashire, it got distinctly worse on Friday of last week, when the Dutch government announced that it was going to establish a 5-year extension to its moratorium on unconventional gas exploitation. And this is from the Dutch subsidiary of Quadrilla. There's the location, so just simply search for Quadrilla in the Netherlands, and you'll be able to see what Quadrilla are not going to be able to do anytime soon in the Netherlands. It seems that the jungle drums are not working too quickly. The information hasn't got through to Australia, to AJ Lucas, the 45% owner of Quadrilla. where the stock price amazingly still hovers just below 40 cents. That's about 19 pence in real money. Well, something that caught my eye earlier today, this shock jump in the Magellan stock price. Magellan, of course, Colorado-based company with a number of interests in the Weald. This is previously David Lenigas country. And I thought, wow, what has happened here to get a massive leap in the stock price? Well, it didn't take too long to find nothing too much to worry about. Magellan had actually announced a 1-for-8 reverse stock split. So in other words, they've basically combined 8 stocks now into one to meet the requirements of the AIM market to be able to trade in the alternative investment market. Well, now, finally, the last item before we take the short break, before moving into our discussion with Dr. Ian Fairlie. And it's a recognition of the absolutely amazing achievements of Frack-Free Witney. Frack-Free Witney, there we see, it is the only frack-free community in the country that has actually succeeded in getting DEC, the Department of Energy and Climate Change, to completely exclude it from the area being put up for grabs in the 14th round. So our congratulations to the Frack-Free Witney Committee. And here's the committee. There's the chairman. You might recognise the chairman there. That's David Cameron. The secretary is Rebecca Brooks. And the treasurer, Jeremy Clarkson. And what an amazing success they have had there in making sure that Witney is not subjected to any unconventional gas licenses whatsoever. And it seems that Jeremy Clarkson has actually, since his dismissal from the BBC and Top Gear, has had a change of heart, because here he is. Jeremy Clarkson joins the Guardian drive for fossil fuel divestment. So just to look at that a little bit closer, of course, Witney is David Cameron's constituency. So remarkable achievement there, David. We really want to know how you did that, because there's a lot of other places around the country that would like to get exactly the same exemptions. So more of Frack-Free Witney, I'm sure, in future programmes. Then last, but by no means least, I want to draw your attention to a fundraiser being launched by the groups on the Fylde Peninsula, because you'll remember from our discussions of the last couple of weeks that Lancashire County Council actually rejected Quadrilla's applications to drill and frack at both Rossiter and Preston New Road. But somewhat disturbingly, they did actually grant Quadrilla's application to drill 3 exploratory wells at Rossiter, which effectively gives them the opportunity to establish a well site and also to establish 88 seismic arrays around the area. And as one of the councillors said, really this is a bit remarkable, because it's like being denied permission to build a battleship, but then still seeking permission to build the dry dock. Well, nonetheless, the clock can't be turned back. That permission was approved under somewhat dubious circumstances. So the local community groups are now fundraising to pull together the £10,000 that they need to launch a judicial review. The fundraising campaign was started just a couple of days ago, and this was at 4 o'clock this afternoon, £850, but I think as of this evening it had broken through the £1,000 barrier. So there's 27 days still to run there. So if you can contribute to this absolutely essential fund, every little helps, so please do so. Right, that's the quick wind-up for the week. So we'll take this very short break, and when I come back, we'll be with Dr. Ian Fairlie.
Do you suffer from arthritis or have weak joints? Is it making your life hard? Shark Tech, nature's best kept secret for strong joints and a powerful immune system. Shark Tech, the product with bite. Visit us at www.sharktech.org.
and welcome back to part 2 of Fracking Nightmare. Now, I'm joined tonight by a very special guest, Dr. Ian Fairlie. Did I pronounce that right? It's Ian Fairlie, yes, that's it.
That's correct, yeah.
Who is a specialist on radioactivity in the environment. So, Ian, welcome, and thank you very much for joining me this evening.
My pleasure.
So, Ian, I know that you've been following events as they've been unfolding with this unconventional gas agenda in the UK. You've been working closely with another tremendous supporter of the anti-fracking community, Dr. David Smythe. So what was it that first got you interested in radioactivity in the environment? Because that wasn't your original study, I think.
Well, yes, I have been interested in radioactivity in the environment ever since Chernobyl, way back in 1986. My main subject of research in the past, whilst I was at university, was radioactivity and discharges from various nuclear plants, especially in the UK. And that has sort of moved on to radioactivity in the environment, but not from nuclear, but from fracking. The thing about it is that not many people are aware that, in fact, there's a lot of radioactivity underground, a lot. It's quite amazing how much there is. By the way, it's the reason why the center of the Earth is hot. It's because of the radioactivity and the radioactive decay that's going on. The thing is that, if I can ask you to remember that there's been a lot of oil and gas exploration been going on since mid-1960s, but in the North Sea. And what we found there is that the workers who are working on the oil rigs and the pipe fitters, the welders, the engineers, the mechanics, they're all classified as radiation workers because of the amount of radiation they've received from the various radioactive residues coming ashore. When you pump oil and gas ashore through the pipelines, there's a lot of radium in the pipelines, and it deposits itself on the insides of the pipes, so that when the oil rig workers come along and do their work on it, open up the valves and cap the pipes, they are exposed to a lot of radioactivity. Now, that isn't so much a problem for the public in North Sea oil and gas because, well, nobody lives there. But what's happening now, of course, is that we're having oil and gas being explored here on land, close to people who are, exposed to the various radioactive residues coming from the oil rigs and the gas rigs from fracking.
But Ian, has there been any studies on the health risks, particularly associated with radioactivity, on the risks? I mean, it is pretty much an established actuarial fact that the life expectancy of people that have spent a career on the rigs is somewhat less than it might be if they'd had another occupation on land in the UK, which is why they're able to retire at sort of 60 on very healthy pensions, because the life expectancy isn't necessarily considered to be
very high.
But I mean, has there been any formal studies, to your knowledge, on the subject?
There's not been any epidemiological studies, no, none whatsoever. And none on the land either. I'm pretty sure there's not been any. In fact, fracking has been it's a relatively new phenomenon, and most of the studies that we've seen are from the States, and they are not ill health studies. They are measurement studies, detecting and measuring the concentrations of the gas which is coming up at the wellhead. So that's the stage we're at right now. We've not got to the point where there are actual health studies as such.
Well, that tends to follow because the oil and gas industry is renowned for not initiating any studies that it thinks might actually be detrimental to its long-term interests, yes, or even short-term interests, come to that. And we've seen this very much in Australia, where the health impacts in Queensland, which is a lot less densely populated than the UK, but the health impacts are already starting to be undeniable. But the industry and the government does not want to investigate because it knows that the answer would not be conducive to continuing the current agenda.
Yes, I mean, the reports that I've seen so far are what I call anecdotal evidence. In other words, people saying that there seems to be an increase in this area. There's not been any rigorous studies done so far. There should be.
If you don't study it, you see, you don't find it, do you?
Exactly.
Now, let me just pull up this slide from a presentation that you've sent me kindly, which talks about the radioactivity from fracking. And so you identify three elements here. The gas wells bring to the surface gases, liquids and solids containing radioactive residues. Radioactive waste are generated in produced water, sludges and pipeline scales, and methane gas is contaminated with radon gas, which can't be separated. So let's take the first two. I mean, obviously, once something comes to the surface, something has to be done with it. So it's either obviously utilised as the core product, or it's effectively waste.
Yes, if we're talking about gas wells, then the gas is piped off, but you have a lot of sludges, liquids. They're usually put into, from what I've seen, they're put into waste tanks or residue tanks, storage tanks at the wellhead. And there they settle, and the sludge goes to the bottom, and the liquid, the clearer liquid at the top, is piped off and usually goes to the sea. Or in the case of Lancashire, it was going to be pumped into the Manchester Ship Canal, which of course empties into the sea. But from my understanding, that's been stopped. And with the remaining sludge, which is quite radioactive, they were going to truck that to a landfill site, a licensed landfill site, licensed to take radioactive residues.
Now that in itself sounds very disturbing, but I mean, let's put it in some perspective, of course. So what sort of levels of radioactivity are we talking about here? I mean, is it something that, I mean, obviously it concerns you, so it's obviously something that's above the background norm, but to what degree?
It's highly variable. It depends very strongly on what the radioactive concentrations are below the ground. And these vary tremendously. Indeed, in my PowerPoint presentation that I sent you, I showed you values from an IAEA study in 1993, I think it was. No, 2003, I beg your pardon, which shows huge variation in the values. And I also showed you values from Lancashire, which were slightly worrying in the sense that they were well above background levels. For example, radon levels in the background in the UK is, roughly speaking, average of 3 becquerels per cubic meter, but they were finding at the wellhead it was up to 60, 70, 80 becquerels per cubic meter. That's quite a hefty increase. The point is that none of this is being taken into account, either by the developers or by the people who are opposing them. And I think that it's a major consideration. And it really should be taken into account by both sides.
But the industry would say, oh yeah, but you know, that kind of level of radiation is insignificant and it's not going to have any long-term effect. There's nothing to worry about, so let's not even go there.
How do they know?
They don't, of course.
They don't, of course. That's the whole point. What you've got to do, and this is what the HPA report from 2012 said, you've got to do a baseline study and measure the concentrations of radium and radon that you're getting just from the test rings you're using. And also make a measurement before you actually do any work. And then you can compare that with what happens afterwards. What I'd like to stress is this. We're sort of behind the curve as to what's happening in the United States. And in the United States, they're about 7 or 8. They've been going for fracking for about 7 or 8 years. And now, as the chickens are coming home to roost, people are now beginning to realize that radioactivity is a serious problem. And for that reason, the city of New York has banned fracking from anywhere within its borough.
Well, the state of New York. The state of New York is actually...
The state of New York has.
Yes.
Both have, the city
and the state, yes.
Yeah. Funny enough, the state is smaller, well, population-wise, smaller than New York City. But anyway, both of them have. Now, to me, that, and also other places too, even parts of Texas have banned fracking, which is a bit of a mind boggle. But the point I'm making is that the more that we learn about these things, the more that people begin to realize that there are dangers and that we should really take these into account. Just to give you an example, the people in the United States realized that if you were trucking or shipping by a pipeline the methane gas to big cities, which would be piped right into the gas hobs, the gas heaters of houses, that would liberate the radon in the gas, because radon is inert and doesn't react, doesn't burn, and you breathe in the radon. In fact, it's a bit more complex than that. It's the decay products of radon that you breathe in. They are really, really serious. They include radium-226, which isn't very nice at all. And also a series of other byproducts, decay products, about a dozen altogether, including polonium-210, which of course is the substance used to kill Litvinenko back in 2006. I'm not saying that the polonium came from Norm, but the people who used polonium-210 chose it for the fact that it's supremely lethal. It's very, very, very radioactive, very dangerous, nasty. And there's small amounts of that anywhere you've got radium or radon.
Now, you use the term norm there, and I mean, let's just make sure that people understand that. Norm is a normally occurring radioactive material, which can actually be a bit of a misnomer, because people think that because the title is normally occurring, or naturally occurring radioactive material, they think that therefore it's not a problem.
Yes, it's a very carefully chosen language by the oil and gas industry. I don't call it norm. I call it highly dangerous radioactive material which comes from the ground. It's doesn't quite trip off the tongue as well as norm, but it is much more accurate.
And I mean, let's just touch on the radon again, because we're broadcasting from the southwest of England, which is has a naturally high radon level. And I mean, there are parts of the area, in fact, a property that I lived in some years ago had a radon sink. And in fact, all new properties in that area, one of the requirements in construction was that they had a radon sink.
Sump, yes.
Yeah.
Radon sump in the basement. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's very true. Now, radon is a problem. There's no doubt about it. But just because it exists and occurs naturally, that doesn't justify that we should add more to it in the environment. Give you a little example. There are other nasty chemicals like, say, furans and dioxins, which are really highly toxic. They occur naturally, especially in a forest fire, quite high levels. But the existence of these chemicals doesn't justify industrial processes which put out more. Key thing. Just because it happens to exist naturally doesn't justify what you're doing.
Well, and of course, as we've touched on, you've got the issue of waste disposal. So we've got radon, which is effectively disposed of when you light your gas or use your gas, because
Not disposed of. No.
it just becomes a waste product and it's just dissipating into the atmosphere. So,
Inside your kitchen.
Inside your kitchen. So that's how the industry is effectively disposing of it. by effectively venting it right at the far end of the downstream, with the consumer.
Yes.
So that's one part of
the reason being is you can't separate the two.
Right. So there's nothing they can do until such time as you ignite it, which then separates, obviously.
Technically speaking, there are some things you can do. For example, what you could do is you could build a huge tank and leave it there for about a month, maybe 5 or 6 weeks, and by which time about 99% of the radon will have decayed, because it's got a half-life of 3.8 days, and if you wait long enough, a lot of it will decay. But none of the proposals that I've seen, either in the United States or here, have talked about having these decay chambers, is a good way of putting it. None of them, mainly because it adds to the expense. Absolutely.
So once again, what the public and general consumer doesn't know about, they're not going to worry about.
You betcha.
Yeah. So then, of course, we've got the waste of the solids and the liquids, which in the US, of course, and in Australia, they have been using these abominations known as evaporation pits. But by the way, in Australia, in Queensland, they have now made evaporation pits illegal. So the oil and gas companies have simply changed the name to transfer pits.
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh.
No, and as my good friend Brian Monk says, well, I suppose that's quite correct. You put the water and the liquids and everything into the evaporation pit, and it transfers into the sky. But it's the same process, just changing the nomenclature. But fortunately, in Europe, evaporation pits are illegal, which of course gives the industry the headache then of the dual disposal of the liquids and the solids and the sludge. Exactly. Now, this is why Eberston Moor in North Yorkshire is such a concern, because Third Energy are looking to dispose of basically all the waste products by simply drilling a re-injection well and re-injecting the waste into a different layer of geology from that which they extracted it in the first instance, which would be a first in this country.
Well, I just hope that the people who are proposing that are living on top of the area where their water comes from, the area that they're fracking into, or that they're dumping into.
Well, it's a bigger problem, because actually the whole area provides Scarborough with its water. And when at the last North York Moors Planning Committee, when the hydrologist that the North York Moors Planning Committee had commissioned to provide an independent report, when he was asked directly what Plan B was for Scarborough's water in the event of any contamination, and his response was quite succinct. He said, there is no Plan B. And yet they still insist. I mean, that's why I'm going back to Helmsley on July the 23rd, because Third Energy have resubmitted their application to establish this re-injection well. And the reason they want to do that is because they know very well that this wet gas has such phenomenal levels of waste that to truck it out of there would just be completely impracticable. So they want to take the easy option, which is simply to drill a hole in the ground and pour it straight back in.
That's crazy.
Well, you couldn't put it more succinctly if you tried, could you, really? It is absolutely crazy. So now the sludge. Now, yes. My understanding, we touched on this, Quadrilla had sent their waste from Priest Hall to the United Utilities waste treatment plant in Davyhulme, where before anybody knew it, the United Utilities had effectively pumped 800,000 gallons of supposedly treated fluids into the Manchester Ship Canal. But they apparently do not have any idea what to do with the remaining solids. And they are now seeking input from other specialist companies around the globe, sending them samples to try and find a solution. So my guess is that if they're doing this, then this sludge is too radioactive to be put into landfill?
It depends. There are limits to the concentrations that you can put into landfills. So if it's below a certain concentration, then you can. If it's above, then you've got a real serious problem in your hand. And some proposals I've seen would be to dilute the sludge with other materials to make sure that it's less radioactive than the limit. But since there aren't any actual fracking operations going on right this very minute, we don't really know what is likely to happen. And from what I can see, none of the operators have had their, apart from the case of Earth, which was...
there was Dart Energy.
Dart Energy, yes,
Yeah.
and that was sort of similar to fracking, coal bed methane extraction.
Yeah, that was the dewaterification process, yeah.
Yeah, that had a formal semi-legal hearing lasting about 3 weeks near Falkirk, and that did go into the matter in quite a lot of detail. And it was something that worried the various local authorities nearby. And from what I could, since this wasn't an area that I was asked to discuss, I had to leave it before the end of the hearing. I don't think the issue was fully resolved. So that although the Dart Energy said that they were going to put it into a licensed site, the name of that licensed site wasn't disclosed. Interesting.
Well, and then the next case coming up, of course, will be North Yorkshire again. This is the well at Kirby Misperton, which lies literally just outside the community, less than 1 kilometre, or in fact almost exactly 1 kilometre from the entrance to the Flamingo Land, which is the most significant revenue earner. In fact, I've got a slide here. Here we go. If we can pull this up on screen, down in the bottom corner here. This is let's go back. Down in the bottom corner here, this is the well site where there is a producing gas well, but that's a conventional gas well, and that's pumping gas to a power station a few miles away. But they drilled a deep well there, known as KM8, Kirby Misperton 8, and as you can see, it's exactly 1 kilometre from Flamingo Land, from the entrance to Flamingo Land. And then this is the village. This is the community of Kirby Misperton. And apparently here now, I think it's in this field here, is a camping and caravan site, which will be approximately about 400 or 500 metres away from the well site. And yet Third Energy have, as far as I'm aware, not disclosed yet what they plan to do with the waste.
If it were me, and I would be asking the company that... Are you still there?
Yes, I'm listening.
I would be asking the company that pumps gas to the gas-fired power station if what the concentrations of radon are in their pumped gas. I bet you they've never measured it. The thing is that it'll be burned at the power station, and who's going to get it in the neck but the workers there? And they are totally oblivious to the fact that there's this big danger there. And so that's my first question to them is, what are the radon concentrations in the gas you're pumping? Absolutely. By the way, I have looked into radon concentrations in the gas that comes from ashore, from the North Sea, and it's very low. And one of the reasons why it's very low is because it takes quite a while to come ashore. It takes about a month to come ashore. And during that month's transit time, the radon has decayed. So there's not much of a problem. But if you're taking the stuff right out of the ground in a frack site and putting it into the pipelines of people nearby, then it is a problem.
Now, and this is a very, very interesting point, because actually this is the first time I've heard this issue raised in this way. That I mean, so there is a solution in dealing with the radon. There's only one factor, of course. There is a solution, but it's a solution that the industry certainly won't want to hear because of the cost factor of storage for anything up to 6 to 8 weeks.
Another thing is that you're talking about big volumes here.
Yeah.
And it would look like one of the old-fashioned gasometers. Do you remember the old?
Of course, absolutely, yes.
It would look like that. And can you imagine that in a nice leafy glade in suburbia land? No, they don't want gasometers in their area. In other words, it would be visually very intrusive.
Indeed. Although that would be the least of their worries. Now, this is a slide from your presentation and your advice to communities that are faced with applications from unconventional gas companies. So can you maybe just talk us through this?
Sure. The key thing is that during public hearings, the consultations here, there should be local authorities, at the very least, should be demanding data on radium levels in discharge waters, in the sludges, and in the pipework scale. In other words, they may not have exact numbers because obviously they haven't started it up yet, but what they can do is they can provide estimates and they can provide data from historical data, which I've actually presented in my PowerPoint presentation earlier on. In other words, to get it out into the public, how high these concentrations can be. That's the first thing. So that's radium. The second thing is to look at radon gas and ask for data on radon gas. Again, there'll have to be estimates, but that brings the issue out into the open. Because once you start talking about it, you have to produce estimates, you have to look at what's happened in the past, you have to address the issue. The other thing is to demand that their baseline studies be set up. By the way, there's a very famous HPA document from HPA meaning Health Protection Agency, from 2012. By the way, HPA has changed its name to Public Health England. On the health dangers of fracking, and that says that you must carry out baseline studies. There you go. I mean, this is not us saying, this is the government agency.
So let me just change tack a second, because I know that I only introduced you to this document a few hours ago, but this is a document I stumbled across a few weeks ago now, when I was actually trying to understand perhaps why Francis Egan of Quadrilla was so ecstatic at getting his seismic arrays approved by Lancashire County Council when he'd already had the application to drill and frack the well rejected. And this is basically a proposition to seek funding or to invite tenders for funding to investigate the potential of hydraulically fractured geology for the disposal of radioactive waste. Does this seem like a reasonable plan to you?
It's the second time I'm going to use the word crazy, but it's, if anything, it's even crazier than before. The point is that to make sure that radioactive waste is really dangerous, it lasts for thousands of years. Initially, it's very hot, and you don't really muck around with it, and you shouldn't really be putting it into areas which you've fracked. You need both an engineer barrier and also a geological barrier to stop the radioactivity from getting back up to the surface again.
And the concern over this document is exacerbated because, of course, the Infrastructure Act was modified to allow the unconventional gas companies to pretty much leave anything they want in the ground.
Which is crazy, I know. I mean, it's just... I find that the governments, like before that, coalition, their attitudes towards fracking is, I find it very difficult to understand. It's basically, they seem to have thrown away the rule book and allowed, and the motto being, drill, baby, drill. Well, I don't think that's a very good policy for energy or for the environment. And I think that more thought has to be gone into, or put into all of the health effects and the underground effects. We shouldn't be mucking around with underground aquifers, if you seem to be doing right now. I find it very disturbing. There's also an issue we haven't talked about, and that is, this is, I mean, fracked oil and gas. These are fossil fuels, and here we are, clearing the decks, rushing ahead with another kind of fossil fuel. When the warning signs are all around us that climate change problems are getting worse. And for the government to be pushing ahead with this, with the speed with which it's doing, well, words a bit fail me. I would say two things. One is that it's highly irresponsible, and secondly, I would say it's deeply immoral too.
Absolutely. And Ian, you know, one of the things that disturbs me greatly is that all of the academics who, in my opinion, like yourself, you know, speak from the heart, but also obviously, you know, with a strong scientific understanding, are effectively retired. You know, getting academics who are still working within academia or within industry, scientists who are working within industry, getting them to actually speak out is nigh on impossible. You know, is the power of the paycheck so enormous that
Yes.
these people will effectively prostitute themselves and suppress what they know to be the truth?
The one like you calling them that, but if you've got a family with a spouse and two kids, and you're paying a big mortgage, yep, it's important.
Well, and I think, as I said to you when we spoke a few days ago, I mean, I absolutely acknowledge that, you know, I was the epitome of the corporate whore. You know, right up until, it took me 45 years, you know, of my life to sort of step out of the belly of the beast. But, you know, I do actually understand the seduction of the salary check. And I do understand how difficult it is to let that go, and when you do let it go, everything that, you know, does go with it. But it's sad that you have to be retired to draw the line in the sand.
I know, it's ridiculous. It's a bit invidious. It's not everybody that's like that. I mean, there are a number of academics still in practice who are putting their heads above the parapet, shall we say. Stuart Hazeldine, for example, in this area. He's another geologist, colleague of David Smiles. And there are one or two others who are still working in academia. I would say this, that if you were working in a university in the Glasgow area, you're more likely to be pro-fracking, and if you're working in a university in the Edinburgh area, you're against it.
Sure.
So it's a wee bit, not completely, by the way, Harriet Watt's different, but it's a little bit like that. And it's, by the way, it's, I'm not too harsh on people who are working in academia, who keep their heads down. Back in the 1980s, 1990s, far more did put their head above the parapet. But in the last 20 years, it's become a rotten time for morals in Britain. And people are not morally inclined as they used to be. For example, I think, in 2007, 2008, when the Sustainable Development Commission was abruptly abolished by the incoming coalition government, not a single person said anything about it. But the thing is, fracking is the epitome of a non-sustainable development.
Absolutely.
And so it's a hard time. The thing is that if everybody is waving the flag and saying yeah to fracking, it's difficult for you to stand up and say no. It really is. It isn't easy. It's what I would call, there's a word for it, it's called hegemony. If everybody is saying, this is just wonderful, this is the best thing in the world, it's just sliced bread, it's really hard to stand up against the flow.
Well, even when the evidence is unfortunately so almost overwhelming, I would say.
Absolutely.
Now, Ian, in the last few minutes that we have together, I just want to draw your attention to this document. I'm sure you're aware of it, but this is the document, of course, the white paper that the British government published last July, implementing geological disposal, which effectively outlines the British government's 100-year plan to turn the UK into a nuclear waste dump. I mean, you've used the word crazy a number of times, and I think it's the most appropriate scientific term that one can apply to this plan too. And you may or may not be aware that just a few months ago, in the dying breaths of the previous government, they rushed through a vote that was 277 to 33, which effectively removed all local authority participation in the decision-making process as to where to dump toxic nuclear waste in the UK.
National infrastructure
Exactly.
projects, including nuclear waste. Yeah, it's pretty rotten stuff, really. I didn't watch it, but I knew that it was happening, and I spoke to other people who went to the hearings, and it was a shameful episode. It really was. Talk about democracy.
Yeah, really.
Threw it up in the air, really. However, I wouldn't sort of say all is lost. There's still powerful opposition in Cumbria to the project going ahead, because it's going to be in Cumbria, nowhere else. There are some one district council anyway, who are gung-ho for getting the waste on their land. They're the people who work at Sellafield, and of course they think that radioactivity is fine, so that they're quite happy to have radioactive waste on their land. And the government seems to be determined to push this through. But there'll be massive demonstrations, I'm pretty sure of it. The opposition's already building up. And so we'll see what happens.
Indeed. Well, it is true. This issue and the fracking agenda, the unconventional gas agenda, as I've said many times on this program, is actually drawing communities together.
Yes.
Like nothing before. And, initially it starts with a single community, and then those communities grow, and now we have over 300 communities around the country.
Really, 300?
Absolutely. All, working independently, autonomously, but at the same time, very highly networked. So there is a cohesion there, but it's a leaderless cohesion. It's a wonderful organic hydra that, yes, is certainly becoming a bit of a challenge for the establishment. But just for people to get an insight, I want to show this. This is a schematic from the Onkala nuclear waste storage facility in Finland. Now, Finland is a country that is 40% larger than the UK and has a population of about 5.5 million. So that's less than 10% of the population of the UK.
Yes.
And if you want to see what Finland has done, then look no further than this documentary. It's an online documentary. It is subtitled. I mentioned it last week, but it's absolutely well worth the 2 hours of your time to watch it. It's called Into Eternity, with the Finnish nuclear waste specialists literally almost laughing about the fact that they're building a facility that they're expecting to last 100,000 years.
Well, that makes you wonder. You know, the whole of recorded history is 10,000 years.
Exactly. And they're acknowledging that. I mean, they're acknowledging that they're looking to build a facility to hold nuclear waste that's been generated literally over the last few decades and store it, you know, some considerable distance below ground for 100,000 years.
It really is bizarre. You know that in the United States, they back in the 1950s, when there was a mad rush, you know, to get uranium for the Manhattan Project, and there was a lot of development. Well, the Manhattan Project and all the nuclear developments are going on, and they dumped a lot of the stuff in fairly makeshift underground pits, and on top they put a marker, a concrete marker saying "Do not dig" type thing, and you know. That was, 60 years ago, 65 years ago? And those markers are almost impossible to read now.
Yeah.
65 years ago.
Let alone 100,000 years.
Oh, yeah. It's just ridiculous, yeah.
Ian, we're out of time.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing your insights with us. And you do have a website. I think it's www.ianfairlie.org. Yeah, that's Ian Fairlie, that's Fairlie, ianfairlie.org for more information on Ian's work. Ian, I'm sure we'll be speaking again, and thank you so much for your contribution in helping us fight this insidious industry.
Good one.
Thanks a lot. Okay, well, that's it for Fracking Nightmare tonight. We will be back next week, so join me for episode 60 next Monday. Thank you and good night.